folks, before we start officially today, thank you for coming. I was just pointing out to Ms. Chu that clearly the Majority Leader doesn't call the Subcontracting Workforce Committee to clear their schedule for votes with us. And we just received a note that we'll be voting today at about 10:15. It will be a fairly long series of votes. It looks like there's 3 or 4 amendments, plus a motion to recommit and then the vote on the underlying bill. So that I would imagine the vote series would take someplace between half an hour and 45 minutes. So we'll go as far as we possibly can until they ring the bell, and then we'll adjourn the meeting and come back as quickly as we possibly can. I apologize in advance to the witnesses and to the folks who are here to participate and to watch. As those of you who have done this before know that this happens probably more often than not. So with that, we'll call this meeting to order. We're here today to talk about small business and specifically subcontracting. We're going to look at the challenges small businesses face when they're both the prime contractor as well as when they are the subcontractor. Additionally, this hearing will examine the 3 systems the government uses to monitor and promote small business subcontracting. When a prime contract is set aside for small business, the government wants to make sure that the small business is not simply a front for a large business. So the Small Business Act requires that the small business perform a certain percentage of the work. However, there are 2 problems with the current system. It's very hard to catch bad actors and very hard for small businesses who want to comply. These problems make legitimate small businesses pay even more in compliance costs and in turn waste even more taxpayer money. While many of the contracts we'll hear about today deal with the 8A program, especially the Alaska Native Corporations program, these problems are not limited to any single program. However, it is inevitable that the larger dollar contracts obviously attract more attention. By addressing these challenges, we hope to open up opportunities for legitimate small businesses to obtain government contracts. The government-wide goal, again, we've talked about many times in this committee, for small business prime contracting dollars is 23%. And legitimate small businesses, not fronts for large corporations, deserve those contracts. There are also challenges when small businesses are the subcontractors. In fiscal year 2010, federal prime contractors subcontracted over $200 billion. The SBA has established a government-wide goal of awarding 35.9% of those subcontracting dollars to small business, a goal that has decreased from 40% less than 5 years ago. To help small businesses compete for those $200 billion in subcontracts, large prime contractors are required to submit subcontracting plans. These plans detail how much a business will subcontract to each type of small business. Failure to make a good faith effort to comply with this plan is supposed to result in a fine. However, companies are failing to report to the government on their actual subcontracting achievements, and yet no prime contractor ever has been fined as a result. So clearly, in the last 5 years, all of the almost 3,000 prime contractors have always perfectly submitted their subcontracting plans worth over $1 billion, or we have a serious problem on enforcement. We need to address how to retool the subcontracting program. Finally, there are 3 systems that the federal government uses to monitor and promote subcontracting. First, the Federal Subcontracting Reporting System, which requires that all contractors report each subcontract above $25,000. Second, the Electronic Subcontracting Reporting System, which requires that firms with subcontracting plans report their subcontracts. And third, there's the SBA Subcontracting Network, which allows prime contractors to post subcontracting opportunities over $10,000 for small businesses to compete for. We need to examine duplication in these systems as well as their effectiveness. Small business, both prime and sub, are good for government and good for the economy. They increase competition, increase innovation, create jobs, and save taxpayer dollars. As this subcommittee considers today these issues surrounding small business and subcontracting, we want to learn how we can prove compliance without unduly burdening small firms. If we succeed at that goal, we will help businesses compete, create jobs, and save taxpayer dollars. I want to thank our witnesses in advance for their participation again today. It's good to see both of you, which will help us achieve these ends. I now yield to Ms. Chu for her opening remarks before introducing the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today, small businesses are looking for so many opportunities to grow stronger and expand. As the driving force behind nearly 2/3 of new jobs, this is critical for the economy. One way that we can enhance small firms' job-creating power is through the federal procurement marketplace. In the last decade, the government has doubled its contracting efforts to more than $500 billion per year. This makes the U.S. government one of the largest single buyers of goods and services in the world. Typically, prime contracts are generally viewed as the most lucrative way for entrepreneurs to participate in this marketplace. However, subcontracts are nearly as important. I'm so glad that today's hearing is focused on this very important issue. In fact, last year, small businesses received $97 billion in prime contracts while receiving an additional $74 billion through subcontracting opportunities. For subcontracts, this totaled 35% of all contracts, just shy of the 35.9% goal. This reality is that subcontracting is a critical avenue for entrepreneurs to work with the government, particularly for those dealing with the current economic slowdown. Although subcontracts are an important entry point, more needs to be done to make them accessible to small firms, and today's hearing will help us shed light on this. The preparation and enforcement of subcontracting plans is a critical area that needs to be strengthened. For businesses like the ones here today, such plans are absolutely essential to winning work. However, given recent GAO reports, it's clear that more needs to be done to make these plans more effective. One of the main issues is that limiting the effectiveness of these plans is both the lack of SBA personnel, namely PCRs and CMRs, and I'm glad that the agency is here to address this point. An adequate and thorough review of these plans is important, but there's simply not enough staff to do so. With more than 3 million contracting actions each year, the less than 100 staff assigned to these reviews is insufficient. Additionally, it's well understood that there's a lack of penalties and incentives regarding the implementation of a subcontracting plan. This means that in many cases, small businesses will continue to be an afterthought rather than a primary focus. I'm also looking forward to exploring the tools that exist for small businesses to become subcontractors. For example, the SBA operates the database called Subnet. Through this system, prime contractors can post subcontracting opportunities and small businesses can search through these entries. However, as posting is not mandatory, the website presents limited opportunities. A current search of the database reveals only 100 active solicitations. If we want to draw in more small businesses, particularly those that are not regular government contractors, we must improve mechanisms like this. Finally, in light of recent allegations about fraud and abuse in SBA's contracting programs, it's worth talking about subcontracting from another perspective. Unfortunately, in some instances, subcontracts have become a means to defraud the government and take opportunities away from legitimate small businesses. To prevent those abuses from occurring, more resources must be directed to oversight and penalties have to be strengthened. Despite these challenges, subcontracting remains a vital means for small businesses to access government contracts. Channeling more procurement opportunities to them is a smart policy. Doing so spreads the economic power of the federal procurement marketplace to more companies and communities. With the economic challenges on the horizon, this is more important than ever. While we're always talking about the need for diversification in business models, the slowdown has made this particularly important, especially for small firms. For these businesses, government contracts put another option on the table. By further opening the federal marketplace to small businesses, we can ensure that entrepreneurs have an opportunity to win new customers in a new market. And this is key because while our economy is showing promise, the recovery remains fragile. We'll need to see significant job growth, and this job growth can come mainly from small business.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Just by way of logistics here, we have always been a little loose with the 5-minute rule in this committee, so what you'll see is the green light in front of you as you begin your testimony. Yellow will go on when you have 1 minute left, and red technically when your 5 minutes is up, but until you hear me quietly banging the gavel, please feel free to continue. I'll introduce the first panel now. The first witness is Mary Kendall, the Acting Inspector General for the Department of the Interior. Ms. Kendall spent much of her career as an attorney for federal law enforcement programs and as a state and federal prosecutor. And since 1999, she served as the Deputy Inspector General. Sitting next to her is Mr. Jordan. welcome back, Mr. Jordan. He served the Associate Administrator of the Government Contracting and Business Development at the U.S. SBA since March of 2009. The Office of Government Contracting and Business Development works to create an environment for maximum participation by small, disadvantaged, and woman-owned businesses in federal government contract awards and large prime subcontract awards. It also plays a major role in the formulation of federal procurement policies and affects small business. Ms. Kendall, we're going to begin with you today, so fire away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Chu, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the challenges in the administration of contracts between the federal government and small businesses. The Office of Inspector General does not purport to know or understand all of the intricacies or challenges that attend to contracts between the federal government and small businesses, but we can comment on our findings relative to the Department of the Interior's handling of several small business contracts, which are, we believe, representative of some of the challenges that influence the management of federal contracts with small businesses. During a recent review, we discovered a service contract with an 8A small business, United Service and Solutions, LLC, that was not in compliance with the statutory subcontracting limitations, which require the prime contractor to satisfy at least 50% of the personnel-based contract costs with its own employees. The Small Business Administration Participation Agreement requires that the contracting officer monitor and enforce that provision. US2, an Alaskan Native corporation, had been noncompliant with the 8A subcontracting limitations for more than 2.5 years. The contracting officer told us that she believed the contractor on an indefinite quantity, indefinite delivery contract, as was the case with US2, has the life of the contract to comply with the subcontracting limit. To the contrary, the Code of Federal Regulations state that in order to ensure the required percentage of costs on an indefinite quantity 8A award is performed by the participant must demonstrate semi-annually that it has performed the required percentage to that date. The CFR goes on to say that the participant must perform 50% of the applicable costs for the combined total of all task orders issued to date at 6-month intervals. In other words, US2 was required to perform 50% of the work every 6 months that the contract was in force. Our Recovery Oversight Office also addressed compliance with the 8A limitations on subcontracting in certain construction contracts funded by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act monies. We found inconsistency in how and whether compliance with the limitations on subcontracting was assessed by DOI contracting officers. This inconsistency was found in compliance monitoring, an absence of department-wide guidance, and a lack of training for contracting officers. Confusion on the roles and responsibilities between SBA and DOI contracting officers contributed to our findings. In the US2 case, in particular, the contracting officer had identified potential problems with the limitations on subcontracting quite early in the life of the contract. SBA, however, indicated that it found US2's plan to address these problems sufficient. Therefore, the contracting officer took this as a signal to continue with the contract. We found this confusion to affect the recovery-funded contracts as well. The Department of Interior has since issued department-wide guidance on the limitations on subcontracting, provided a worksheet with instructions to all contracting officers to assess a contractor's compliance, and has agreed to provide annual training to the acquisition workforce regarding their responsibilities under the 8A partnership agreement between SBA and DOI. Even with a clear understanding of the roles and responsibilities, contracting officers are hampered in their monitoring efforts by receiving incomplete and inaccurate data from their 8A contractors. For example, US2 broke down labor costs by those incurred by US2 and those incurred by its subcontractors, but did not break down other direct costs in the same way. Based on the other direct costs we reviewed, we believe that additional subcontractor labor costs were contained in this category, exacerbating the extent to which US2 was out of compliance with the limitations on subcontracting. In fairness to US2, we do not believe that such manipulation of reporting data is limited to this company, but may well be happening with other 8A contractors as well. Contracting officers are placed at a significant disadvantage to identify such data problems and correct them. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Chu, that concludes my prepared testimony. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Kendall. And our practice here is to save all the questions till after the testimony of the other witnesses. So, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you. Chairman Mulvaney, Ranking Member Chu, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me back here to testify today. As I told you when I was here a few weeks ago, and I sincerely mean, our top priority at SBA is to maximize opportunity for small businesses and ensure the benefits of our programs flow to the intended recipients. My office works each day to provide increased opportunities for eligible small businesses to compete for and win federal prime contracts as well as subcontracts. We are always looking for ways to increase small business contracting opportunities, and in the 2.5 years I've been in my position, the federal government has made significant improvements. For example, in fiscal year 2010, small businesses won nearly $100 billion, or 22.7% of federal prime contracting dollars. Small businesses also won $74 billion, or 35.4% of subcontracting dollars, which was a marked increase from the 28.6% they won in 2008 and the 31.8% in 2009. In terms of subcontracting, our focus at the SBA is on 3 main areas. 1, working with agencies and prime contractors to make sure small businesses get their fair share of federal subcontracting opportunities. 2, ensuring that when a small business is a federal prime contractor, it complies with the limitations on subcontracting requirements. And 3, developing and maintaining the tools, systems, and resources needed to monitor and track subcontracting achievements. I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you our initiatives to address each of these areas. First, one of our top priorities is to ensure that small businesses receive substantial federal subcontracting opportunities. For small businesses, subcontracting is not only a good source of revenue, but it also allows them to gain relevant federal government contracting experience, which may be used as examples of past performance when they bid on future contracts. To help increase small business subcontracting and improve oversight of the process, my office has a team of commercial market representatives, CMRs, who are stationed across the country. Their responsibilities include counseling small businesses, conducting matchmaking events, providing training on the Subcontracting Assistance Program, and conducting compliance reviews of large business prime contractors. Additionally, the Small Business Jobs Act included several provisions specifically related to holding prime contractors more accountable to their subcontracting plans. In fact, we published these proposed subcontracting rules in the Federal Register just yesterday. The first provision is designed to prevent small business subcontracting misrepresentations. The second provision is aimed at mitigating bait and switch, which is when a prime contractor references a small business as its subcontractor in a bid or proposal, but does not utilize the small business in actual performance. The last provision requires prime contractors to notify a contracting officer whenever they reduce a payment or are more than 90 days delinquent in paying a small business subcontractor. Our second area of focus in subcontracting is ensuring that when a small business is a prime contractor, it meets the limitations on subcontracting. Statutes and regulations were developed to ensure that if a small business concern is awarded a set-aside contract, the firm will perform a substantial portion of the contract. Although monitoring compliance with limitations on subcontracting is the responsibility of the contracting officer, SBA is committed to working closely with the Office of Federal Procurement Policy and the federal agencies to ensure they have the appropriate training, tools, and resources needed to monitor compliance. My office also conducts surveillance reviews of contracting activities. These are periodic examinations to provide recommendations on how to increase opportunities for small businesses and to ensure contracting officers are in compliance with small business policies and regulations. As part of these reviews, my team evaluates compliance with subcontracting regulations and provides recommendations to agencies on how to improve these processes and procedures. In addition to these reviews, SBA takes action against firms that violate the limitations on subcontracting. Our comprehensive fraud and abuse prevention strategy has already had significant impact. For example, last year SBA suspended a large company based on evidence indicating a lack of business integrity in federal procurements involving small businesses and an intentional disregard for compliance with the limitations on subcontracting. In the last 2 years, SBA has initiated more government-wide suspension and debarment actions than it had in the previous 10 years. Our third area of focus is ensuring agencies and contracting officers have the tools, systems, and resources needed to monitor and track subcontracting achievements. We work closely with the Office of Federal Procurement Policy and the General Services Administration to ensure these tools are available. The two primary systems used to capture federal subcontracting information are the Electronic Subcontracting Reporting System, ESRS, and the Federal Subaward Reporting System, FSRS. GSA is currently undergoing an effort to combine the various procurement databases into one new system called the System for Award Management, which is being deployed in phases, with the first phase scheduled to be available in the first half of 2012. As demonstrated by the initiatives and efforts described in this testimony, SBA has taken great strides to strengthen our small business prime and subcontracting programs. While we've made significant progress, we continue to look for ways to identify further opportunities for improvement and to maximize small businesses' access to this important source of revenue so they can grow their businesses and create jobs. Thank you for allowing me to share SBA's views and initiatives with you today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. And as our practice here, Ms. Chu will begin with her questions, and then we'll go down to the members, and I'll go last. So, Ms. Chu, fire away.
Mr. Jordan, as you know, there are these major kickback schemes that were discovered. Well, the major kickback scheme that was discovered at the Army Corps of Engineers involving two 8A firms. SBA should be at the vanguard of federal small business procurement and combat the misuse of these small business contract programs, yet the IG office at SBA reported that SBA itself had inadequately planned and inappropriately awarded these two 8A sole source contracts. What tools does SBA need to enforce the federal contract standards and conduct better oversight?
Well, I believe the case in which you're referring to was not where SBA had awarded contracts, but it did involve an 8A firm and a different agency actually awarded and monitored those contracts. It's hard for me to comment on an ongoing investigation, but what I can say is that that type of action is a real demonstration of the type of partnership we have with our Inspector General and the Department of Justice, and evidence that this administration has absolutely zero tolerance for fraud, waste, and abuse. I've talked in the past about some of the enforcement actions that SBA can take, and these are suspensions, debarments, terminations, and those types of things. We don't have subpoena power. We can't prosecute. So what we do is we take all the actions that we can and then turn over all of that evidence to the Inspector General and Department of Justice so that they can investigate further and take appropriate action. And I think that's what you saw the outcome of yesterday or over the last couple of days.
Well, one issue has to do with who is responsible for monitoring compliance, and there's the agency and then there's SBA. The Interior's IG office previously indicated that the agency's 8A program partnership agreement with SBA did not say which agency would oversee the subcontracting restrictions. So what is your comment? Who is responsible?
Contracting officers have the primary responsibility for ensuring small businesses that they enter into contracts with comply with the limitations on subcontracting. That being said, SBA is fully committed to working with the agencies and the Office of Federal Procurement Policy to make sure they have the tools, training, and resources necessary to do that. Now, that's true in any small business set-aside context, be it 8A or any of the other small business set-aside programs. In the 8A context, though, we did see some areas where clarification would be helpful. So in March of this year, we released the first comprehensive revision of the regulations governing that program in more than a decade, and made clear, especially in areas like joint ventures, what was permissible and what was not, clarified some of those rules, and bolstered some of the oversight. Also, just yesterday, we released 3 different subcontracting regulations that implement provisions that Congress passed in the Small Business Jobs Act. The first of those really reaffirms and makes it very clear that it is the contracting officer's responsibility to monitor the limitations on subcontracting compliance when they enter into a set-aside contract with a small business.
So you're saying the agency is responsible?
The contracting officer is, yes, but we definitely want to partner with all of the agencies to ensure that that's happening, that they have the training and awareness about what their responsibilities are, the tools to fulfill their responsibilities, and that the oversight is happening.
But isn't SBA ultimately responsible?
The contracting officer is ultimately responsible for those clauses in a contract that they're entering in, but SBA wants to work to make sure that the policies are set up to ensure compliance and robust oversight, and work with those agencies to make sure that they have the tools necessary to do that.
And Ms. Kendall, is that your understanding?
My understanding that in the agreement between SBA and the agency, at least with Interior, the contracting officer is, in fact, ultimately responsible. I think what we were pointing out in the US 2 example, however, was that there was some review conducted by the SBA that indicated that US 2's plan to come into compliance was adequate, while US 2 never did come into compliance. But the contracting officer took that signal by SBA as an okay to continue with the contract. I think that's where the confusion lay.
And how could that be corrected?
Well, I think just clear communication between SBA and the contracting officers would be one of the very simple ways in this case, and I can really only speak on this case. And I think there was responsibility on both sides, quite frankly, for the contracting officer to push back in their communications with SBA, and SBA to be perhaps more clear in terms of what they meant by the plan was sufficient.
Okay. Ms. Kendall, last year, your office found a U.S. Geological Survey contract that didn't contain the subcontracting limitation provisions. And this clause is there to ensure that small business contracts don't act as a pass-through to large firms. So why is this clause being left out of contracts?
I'm not familiar with the instance that you're referring to, but I would say probably human error. The contracting officers are, like many people, working as hard as they can with the tools that they have, but many of them are overworked. They have more responsibilities in terms of oversight than sometimes they can actually carry out. And again, I don't know what case you're talking about, but I would guess that it was probably just a matter of human error.
This was in the October 2010 IG report by the Department of Interior, which said that the agency was not including the limitation on subcontracting clause in their contracts, and it seems like it should be a standard practice.
It should be, yes, you're right,
and not something that is due to human error, but something that should be a practice.
No, I absolutely agree. Again, I'm sorry that I'm not familiar with the report that you're talking about. Perhaps what I could do is review it after the hearing and get back to you on what the result of that report was. I would hope that we recommended that there be some sort of process or a checklist where this is always included. And I'm just not sure if USGS had done that, but I can certainly get back to you about that.
Okay. Also, in your testimony, you discuss how US2 broke down its own costs and the costs of its subcontractors for only some categories, and it hid additional subcontracting costs where they were actually doing less work than was required. And part of the reason why it seems so easy to circumvent the system is because the accounting and other measures are also so complex. How could we simplify the system so that anyone can figure out whether or not someone is in compliance?
Oh, I wish I could answer that question for you. Perhaps the reporting process would need to be simplified and clarified in this case, and I'm really only familiar with what happened precisely in this case, but in the category of other direct costs, the US2 was putting subcontractor labor costs into that category. A careful review of this by my office revealed that, in fact, the individuals that were contained in other direct costs were subcontractors, but it would not be apparent necessarily to a contracting officer without some greater scrutiny. So there may be a way to simplify the other contract or the other direct costs category, or require them to break it out more thoroughly, where it would become more apparent to the contracting officers.
Mr. Jordan, do you have something to say on this? How could we better fix the reporting system to root out fraud?
Sure. I think there are three things that I would say. One is ensuring that contracting officers and all folks involved in the contracting process are aware of what their responsibilities are. So I mentioned that we came out with new regulations yesterday that clarify a lot of that responsibility, and making sure that everyone is aware and trained on that is going to be very important. The second thing is making sure that we're doing everything we can to drive efficiencies, especially leveraging technology and systems to help contracting officers do their job. I mentioned in my opening statement that the electronic subcontracting reporting system, the federal subcontracting FSRS subcontracting reporting system, as well as some of the other databases and systems involved in federal contracting are all being combined into one system for award management. So let's give contracting officers a single point of entry where they can check a number of these things systematically. Third is we really need to look at the resources dedicated to the contracting officer workforce. You mentioned in your opening statement that contracting spend has doubled. Well, the contracting officer workforce charged with getting those contracts out has not doubled over that same period. And so it's very difficult for these folks, as Ms. Kendall said, to keep pace with all of the things that we would like them to do. You know, we are very clear in the 8A regulations and in other regulations that it's compliance with limitations of subcontracting is responsibility of the procuring agency. And in a set-aside contract, you want, obviously, to make sure that that clause is in the contract and all these types of things. We need to make sure that we're staffed appropriately, trained appropriately, and we're giving them all the tools so that they can do that.
Mr. Jordan, let's talk about the issue of penalties. Last year, GTSI was suspended for performing the majority work for several small business prime contracts, but GTSI was suspended only for a couple of weeks, and yet the small businesses that were involved remained suspended for about a year. I know that firms should face consequences, but why is there this disproportionate treatment for small businesses?
Well, over the last 2.5 years, we have had 5 proposed debarments and 8 suspensions for issues involving subcontracting, and 10 of those involved the prime contractor violating limitations on subcontracting. So there are enforcement actions happening. When it comes to the specific case that you referenced, I'm not the agency's suspension and debarment official, so there's only so much that I can comment on. But what I can say is the decision and the decisions that you reference are those of the agency's suspension and debarment official. So they made the decision to suspend GTSI a year ago, subsequently suspending EG Solutions and Multimax Array First Source 11 months ago. And to the extent those decisions could be made public, they're all posted on our website. The letters make clear that the agency evaluated the evidence and acted decisively based upon everything that we had at the time. So I'm not free to comment further about why additional actions did or did not occur at the time, but I can say that the Inspector General is continuing to investigate GTSI, EG Solutions, Multimax Array on issues arising out of their involvement in these various contracts. And I would direct further questions on that case and on that front to our Inspector General.
Okay, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We now turn to Mr. West from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you. This is a very appropriate subject because just last week I was down in the district talking to the Broward County Small Business Advisory Council, and 2 of the critical issues they brought up relating to the subject here today. The first issue is there's a federal building that is being constructed in Miramar, Florida. And for whatever reason, the prime contractor on that federal building has not gone to look at any of the local subcontractors for opportunities for them being there. Is there some system in place to make sure that when we have these type of contracts down there that we do look at the local subcontractors, because this does come back to, you know, jobs and opportunities within a local environment before we go to outside sources?
So in terms of ensuring that small businesses are a part of it, the prime contractor will have to submit as a material part of the contract, a subcontracting plan that says by percentage basis typically how they plan to allocate their subcontracting among small businesses and various groups of small businesses. And SBA reviewed about 5,000 of those plans last year. Then in terms of which businesses they use, that as long as it falls into compliance with the contract terms, is really up to the prime contractor. Many of them, as they're formulating the solicitation, engage small businesses to understand exactly how much they're going to be able to subcontract to which types of small businesses. Others have a general idea of what small business representation is in those industries and sets aside a percentage and then goes and looks for small businesses to fulfill that percentage. And at that point, in either of those cases that they're looking for subcontractors, we work with our SBA district offices and some of our resource partners to try to make small businesses aware of these opportunities and make both the agency and the prime contractors aware of the great small businesses in all of those industries. In terms of forcing them to utilize businesses from a particular location, other than certain types of contracts, I'm not aware of a provision that allows or forces them to do that.
Well, yeah, I'm not talking about forcing, but at least making sure that the opportunity is provided to local small businesses.
Absolutely.
The second point was very near and dear, because there are a couple of people on this council that were about to lose their businesses. Because obviously what happens, prime contractor comes down, gets a small business subcontractor. Let's say it's an 18-month, 24-month project. Well, you bring in the small business contractor, they do what they're supposed to do in the 3 to 4 month period within that overall larger project. Some of these small businesses, like I said, 2 people there on this council have been affected. Their payment was being held up, even though their work had been completed. It had been certified, it had been signed off. Their payment was being held up until the end of the entire project. Now, small businesses have a very small margin upon which they can operate. We can't continue to allow that to happen to them, because that puts them in very untenable positions. Is there some kind of means by which we can, eliminate that from happening, or, make sure that prime contractors are meeting their obligations to, within a 90-day period after work being completed? And is there an enforcement mechanism in place?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Congressman, that the issue of payment and cash flow is of paramount importance right now. A lot of these small businesses are really going pay period to pay period and need that cash as quickly as possible. There are 2 things that we've done already very recently. One is, as you heard the President say in his address to Congress, and later saw the Office of Management and Budget release, when it comes to small business prime contractors, we have cut the time in which the government takes to pay small business prime contractors in half, from 30 days down to 15 days, and we're working aggressively to make sure that's happening across the board. When it comes to subcontracting, just yesterday, SBA released regulations that says if a prime contractor is delinquent, which we've defined as, after substantial input and public comment period, defined as more than 90 days late, just like you said, in paying its small business subs and assuming the prime's been paid, then they need to report that to the contracting officer, and we're going to put that in the past performance database so that it can be a mark against them for any future awards, to really give them that monetary and performance incentive to make sure they're doing it. We're not done. There are more things that we're looking at to try to accelerate payments to small business subcontractors, much like we worked hard to do so at the prime contract level. There's a few more issues, but I totally agree, and I would point to those things we've already done and say we are looking to do more.
All right. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thanks very much. Ms. Elmers from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both to our panel. Ms. Kendall, along the lines of the US2 situation, I know that we were talking about other direct costs. Do you know why? I mean, were they looking at those direct costs? Were they not? Do you have any insight into that?
I really don't, Congresswoman.
Mm-hmm. And then, too, you had stated that some other Recovery Act contracts also had problems in meeting subcontracting limits. Can you explain what those would have been?
These were very much the same. In construction, the requirement is significantly less than in services. It's a 15% requirement, but we found in the handful of National Park Service construction contracts that we looked at that the same problem was occurring, that they just simply weren't conducting the amount that they were supposed to be.
And so just in listening to your discussion and your comments, it sounds to me like it has more of a simplification of reporting, things like that. How can that be improved? What are your thoughts on that? How can we get more information and everybody on board doing it in a routine manner? Yeah,
I wish I knew the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
My experience in this is looking at it from an oversight body mm-hmm. and really looking at how they're complying with mm-hmm. the requirements. I do not feel like I have the expertise myself to really respond to that.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. And Mr. Jordan, in talking with the situation of basically zero tolerance for fraud, waste, and abuse, and looking at the issues that are facing us right now with some of those things that have been divulged now in some of the fraud that's gone on. If a small business is not compliant, what measures are available right now? I mean, I'm assuming that there are things in place right now for enforcement. And what happens to a contracting officer if they are failing to meet those requirements?
Sure. So the contracting officer would issue a show cause letter to the small business concerned saying, show me how you are or will be in compliance with the limitations of subcontracting. Again, one of the challenges there is that you've got a contract that goes for a period of time. They may be below the 50% at one point in time, but by the end of the contract, they have a clear and rational plan to get above it. So it's not just a snapshot in time. It's what is your plan to, at the end of this contract, meet that limitation on subcontracting. That being said, there are certainly analytical and common sense evaluation factors that the contracting officer is looking for, and they ask for that. If it is clear that they will not be meeting that contract requirement, you could terminate the contract, and there are a host of things that the contracting officer could do. If it's something that moves more into the abusive or fraudulent area, then SBA may get involved as things are referred to us, and that's where we would take things such as suspension and debarment from federal contracting. And these are real tools. As you've seen, the reason that suspensions, I believe, are so important is because the investigations into these bad practices can take, it's not a week's or even a month's thing. It can be a year or years thing. So we try to act when we have clear evidence on the suspension front as quickly as possible. For example, in 2008, SBA had done 0 suspensions in this area. 2009, 1, then 2010, 6, and then 2011, 15. So we really are utilizing this tool in an aggressive way and being serious about that zero tolerance. Then we give all of the things that we find to our Inspector General and to the Department of Justice so they can further investigate and take the more serious actions if appropriate.
Thank you very much, and I give that the balance of my time.
All right, thanks very much. As you can see, we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left to vote. We're going to go ahead. For those of you who aren't familiar with the system, if you want to know when we're going to be back, keep an eye on the TV, which we'll leave on, and when it gets to on passage, that means we'll be back about 15 minutes after that. So if you want to poke your head in from time to time, that'll be great. I expect that we will be back somewhere around 11:15. That's what we'll be shooting for. So what we're going to do is recess here for about 45 minutes, and we'll be back as soon as we possibly can. I apologize for the delay. Thank you. All right, we're going to call the meeting back to order, which means I have to do that. Again, I apologize. Ms. Kendall, I understand your time constraints, and I'm sure you will be out of here in just a few minutes. Move on to the next panel. My question, and it's always difficult to pick right back up where we were when we have an hour break, but I want you all to help me understand the process. Okay, I've run a small business, but I've never done any government contracting. Let's say that I'm one of these 8A organizations. I'll come back to that in some more detail later. But let's say that I'm on one of these no-bid contracts. Walk me through the process. Either, Ms. Kendall, I think this is to begin with Mr. Jordan, on how I get the contract, briefly, but then more importantly, how you make sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, both in terms of me as a contractor and then my relationship with my subcontractors.
Sure. So your first step in the 8A context would be application and certification in this business development program. So now you're in the program and you want to compete for contracts. In the sole source context that you talked about, the agency would identify a contract that they had a particular need, they were going to contract out, and it was suitable for the 8A program. They did their market research. They knew there were 8A firms out there. It was the best small business program to use. So they would contact a district office, or maybe they knew about it. There are multiple ways that this can happen, but they could talk to the district office and say, hey, we know you have an 8A portfolio with various firms here, or we know that this firm can do it, what have you. The district office, the SBA district office would then evaluate, hey, can this firm, does it have the capacity, does it jive with their business development plan that they've submitted to us? Yes, it does. Okay, that contract can go forward. And the agency would then award on a sole source basis, assuming it's within the various limits, this contract to that firm. So over the period of that contract term, every year it has an annual review with SBA as a firm, not just on that contract, but on everything they're doing. How are they improving against their business plan? Are they achieving their targeted objectives? All of those types of things, one of which would be looking at what contracts are they performing against. Then in terms of subcontracting out, in that contract that they had entered into, it would have limitations on subcontracting. So, if it's a services contract, it would say that small business, because this was a set-aside, has to perform at least 50% of the labor costs with its own labor.
Let me stop you there.
Please.
Some of the things that I read say that I'm supposed to be able I wouldn't know how to allocate that in my business. We didn't use the cost accounting system. So tell me how we get around that hurdle. How do I satisfy that requirement, that 50% requirement?
So we talk a lot about when we're engaging with small businesses and getting them up to speed to sell to the government about being contract ready. That's a phrase that you hear a lot. And what that means is a lot of things, but one of which is you have to have all of the systems in place, approved systems in place to do business with the government. So it's very clear what the responsibilities are for the agency in terms of oversight and in terms of the small business to make sure that they can prove that. So because at any time, it's a clause in the contract. The contracting officer can say, show me the documentation that says you're in compliance.
Let me ask a quick question, Ms. Kendall, because Ms. Chu was asking an interesting line of questions about the examples that one example you gave where there was no subcontracting language in the contract. And she asked if there was a standard procedure. And I guess she's asking it, what I'm asking in a different way is there not a standard contract? Is it pre-printed, or is this written from scratch every single time that Mr. Jordan just described it gets let?
I'm going to have to defer to Mr. Jordan on that one. I truly don't know the answer to that.
That's fine.
There are some differences where clauses get inserted or taken out or whatever, but in the set-aside context, even if, the example that Ms. Chu raised earlier had happened, and if Ms. Kendall's supposition proved to be correct that it was contracting officer error, not including that, we don't care. The fact that it was a small business set-aside means that limitation on subcontracting requirement is part of that contract. Whether or not the contracting officer forgot to include that or didn't cut and paste correctly does not matter in terms of the law. You still have to abide by the limitations of subcontracting because it's a set-aside, and all small business set-asides must.
I will stop you again, Mr. I got news for you. You and I sign a contract for me to do something, and it's not in the contract. I'm pretty certain I don't have to do it.
So our position has always been, for all small business set-asides, the regulations are very clear that the limitations on subcontracting exist. So whether or not they had included that, it is applicable to that small business set-aside.
And the staff tells me that may be the case. It's something unique to small business contracting. So, again,
I'm not a lawyer.
Shows you what my law degree is worth. All right, so now we're in this process. You've signed the contract with me. I'm an 8A provider. I've got this contract. It's under $6.5 million. I'm not an Alaska native. How often do you come to make sure I'm in compliance, and how often do I have to prove to you that I'm in compliance?
So for the contracting officer, who's really monitoring that
agency,
contract,
right?
Yeah, they can do it periodically. They can add if they have any reason to believe you're not in compliance, and then typically it's semi-annually or annually that they would check. Now, if it's a firm fixed price, sole source contract in this case, then the contractor, the 8A firm, you would have to show that you have a plan that you're going to meet the limitations of subcontracting for that whole contract. And so if you dip below the 50%, but you're saying, yeah, we know, but here's why at the end we're going to be back above it, then that can be acceptable. If it's an IDIQ, one of those indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts where you don't know exactly how much money you're going to get over the life of that contract, you're supposed to always be above the limitation on subcontracting.
Okay. I've got this contract. I said, listen, it's going to be $4.5 million. You've looked at it and say, okay, it's going to be $4.5 million. And it's not. It's $2.5 million, really. And what I've done is I've inflated the value of this deal by $2 million. And you see where I'm going in this. I'm not going to ask you specifics about the case that's ongoing. I'm not going to ask you specifics about an ongoing investigation. But let's say that I did that. Let's say that I did exactly what these gentlemen are accused of doing. And instead of giving you a number of $2.5 million, I told you it was $4.5 million. And you said, okay, that makes sense. Where are you going to catch? How are you going to catch my fraud in this process?
There are multiple ways in which these frauds can be caught. Does it become challenging in a generic situation where you have a contracting officer, a representative of the prime contractor, and a representative of the subcontractor all, in a hypothetical sense, engaging in fraudulent activity? Yes. But that's why there are so many different points at which people are checking this.
But even if the contracting officer is not part of this deal, okay, maybe he just thought that $4.5 million was a reasonable number. Isn't one of the standards he has to be able to establish that the government is being harmed by what he sees? I can't. Let me find the research. Hang on a second. There's a list of reasons that. Oh, where was it, Emma? It's in the memo. Yeah. Contracting officers need to prove that the pass-through of the work harmed the government before most agencies take action against the companies. However, if I'm delivering exactly what I promised to deliver, how does he meet that threshold? How does he prove that I'm in non-compliance?
So it depends on exactly what is going on. If it was just a case of inflated pricing or things of that nature, the government before the contract should or may have come up with a independent government estimate on what they expected to cost, and if they expected it to be that inflated price and it was, then that would be more difficult to prove. If it was coming in above what they thought, they would ask a lot of questions and ask for documentation and ask for proof, and that's why you've seen the Office of Federal Procurement Policy push agencies to go more towards these firm fixed price contracts, because when you are all in agreement at the outset of what this is going to cost for you to provide me the goods or services that I've asked for, then it's harder to play those games with inflated costs and try and hide that. Now, the contracting officer would look at these limitations of subcontracting. So how much is the prime actually performing? So is it the sub who's inflating costs because then getting passed back through the prime? Well, that's going to hurt that limitation because the subcontracting dollars will go up. The amount the percentage the prime is doing would go down, and again, that would have to stay above 50%. So those are some of the ways. And then in the 8A context, you're going to have an annual review, and we're going to be talking with you and your firm to make sure you're operating within the business plan. There's a whole host of checks we do too.
And I guess it strikes me that my example of inflating a $2.5 million contract, a $4.5 million contract, might raise some red flags because it's a relatively large percentage. But when you get to the larger contracts, especially ones with the Alaska Native companies, the potential for fraud would grow, wouldn't it? Because the difference between a $2.5 million and $4.5 million contract is a relatively sizable chunk. The difference between a $100 million contract and a $102 million contract wouldn't stand out as much, would it?
Certainly, the percentage difference based on the overcharging in that larger example is less, but the size of the contract would probably indicate that there's more attention being paid to it by the agency overall. And there's two pieces to your question, really, or to my answer to your question. One is the surveillance and monitoring, so making sure that folks at the agency, and when SBA does surveillance reviews and compliance reviews and these types of things, are looking for this type of behavior, and then making sure the enforcement is there to not just punish the bad actors we catch, but disincentivize anybody from trying. So there are some new proposed regulations that will go out, and I've talked about them in terms of the Jobs Act statute that created them around presumption of loss. So in the past, and this is where that harm to the government piece really came in the past, if you misrepresented your size or status to win an award, we would suspend, debar, maybe pursue a False Claims Act action against you through the Department of Justice. But it was hard if the government got exactly what we wanted for a fair price for us to go after you significantly because you lied about being a service-disabled vet. It's really that second place finisher, the true wounded warrior who should have gotten that contract that was harmed. Well, now it doesn't that stuff doesn't matter. The law clearly states if you lie about your size or status to win an award, we can sue you civilly for the full amount of that award and keep what you provided and still do suspensions and termination debarments.
And in the last 12 months, how many times have you all done those things?
Well, this presumption of loss is new, so it's still being stood up. In terms of the suspensions and debarments, we've stepped it up quite a bit. We've done more referrals for suspension and debarment have happened in the last 2 years than the previous 10 years. And I mentioned before the suspension tool, which I think is a really important tool because it's something where SBA can take action while we're waiting for an investigation to run its course, and we want due process to happen, and we want any accused parties to get a full investigation and due process. But we can take this suspension action. In 2008, there was 0. In 2009, there was 1. And then 6 in 2010, and then 15 this year. So we are stepping up the utilization of that tool when we think it's appropriate.
Does the use of that tool partially explain, I guess it can't fully explain, does it partially explain why no fines have ever been issued, the liquidated damages provision? I heard that in my opening comment, and I was actually reading the details during the break, and it's actually worse than I thought. It's in 30 years, there's no record of any company paying liquidated damages, ever.
So when I started 2.5 years ago, and we started to work on, or continued good work that was happening on getting small business more subcontracting opportunity, preventing some of this bait and switch, all these types of things that we just came out with some of the proposed regs on yesterday. That was one of the areas we pushed. Is the subcontracting plan is a material part of the contract. So if you're violating that, you are violating terms of the contract, and there's a whole host of actions, including liquidated damages. Well, the problem that I'm told by agencies is that you can drive a truck through what it means to make a good faith effort to meet the limitations on or meet the subcontracting plan requirements. We've now shored up through these new regs whose responsibility is, what some of the things that you should be looking for are, and what some of the penalties are. But you're right, that is, I've never heard of anybody actually using liquidated.
You want to come up with some suggestions on how to close those loopholes, and this committee will take up those things, because our research indicated the same thing, which is it's very difficult for you all to prove with their safe harbor provisions and the good faith requirements. And if we need to start closing some of those, let's get together and see if we can do that. I'm also, we'll take up probably another day. It's a relatively minor issue, I know, in terms of its footprint, but it seems like these Alaska Native companies are really where some more attention should be. Does the SBA have an official position on that policy as to why ANCs get special treatment?
Well,
they should.
The provisions that allow those types of things are all statutory part of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and follow-on amendments to that. So it's not something that SBA has a position on one way or the other. But what I will say is I'd point to the regulations that we came out with in March, where we really did, and we went around and did tribal consultations and talked to the community about how to get these right. But one of the key provisions in that comprehensive revision, the 8A regulations, deals with the joint ventures, and that was a place where some of the actions that were happening before really didn't pass the smell test, and we've tightened those quite a bit about when you form a joint venture between an 8A firm and a mentor, a larger business, what percentage of the work the 8A firm has to do, and what are some of the subcontracting rules there, and I am proud of what we did there to move as quickly as possible, but also thoughtfully to close any loopholes there.
All right. There was just a couple more questions. There was a Washington Post story about a year ago, and in that story it's pointed out that the SBA had been relying on 3 employees and paper records in Anchorage. I'm going to spend more time another day on these ANCs, but I want to ask this one question. That y'all were using 3 employees and paper records to track some of these companies, and there was $6 billion worth of sole source contracts. Tell me more about that.
Sure. So I have had the privilege of testifying in front of Congress.
By the way, that
times.
doesn't mean I believe everything that I read in the Washington Post. Sorry, they're here someplace.
No, yes. So I certainly welcome the conversation around Native entities and the community benefits that they bestow versus the individual business development of the traditional individually owned 8A firms. When it comes to our operating and overseeing the program, our Inspector General raised some concerns, had 6 recommendations on things that we need to look at. Well, by the time I testified on that report, we'd already fixed 4, and we've subsequently fixed the other 2. We agreed and have taken care of increasing staffing, increasing training on how do you process and oversee the native entity applications, which are much different than when an individual applies or is in the 8A program, and what are the rules that govern the behavior that do fall within our regulatory authority.
Thank you, Ms. Jordan. Ms. Kendall, very, very briefly, come back to the US2 issue. My understanding is that they had contracts of about $250 million, but were running out of a guy's house, essentially. How did y'all get involved? Help me understand the process as to where the Inspector General's office got involved in this investigation.
We got involved in two ways. We actually conducted, we were conducting a joint review with the Department of Defense, IG, which is mandated for them to do, but because it was Sierra Vista's contracting unit, we joined with them and found this contract and flagged it as a problem. We also...
What about the contract made you flag it?
I'm not sure I can tell you right now.
Fair enough.
But we also got a referral from one of the deputy assistant secretaries where they had identified this as a potential problem. So we looked at it both as a result of the audit where this came to light for reasons I will be glad to tell you later. But then we also, the entity itself identified a problem with this particular contract and asked us to take a look at it.
Is it fair to say that that would have been an inquiry within the agency that was initiated by the contracting officer?
I don't know if it was initiated by the contracting officer or someone in the chain of command, but somebody internal to Interior identified it.
And I guess my question is this: did it happen? Let's take your independent investigation off the table. I want to focus on the one that came from the deputy director. Did that happen by accident, or did it happen the way it's supposed to happen?
That I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. And then, so you got involved with it, and then what happened next? You're doing your independent investigation. You're also getting an inquiry from the agency itself.
Yes.
How did you come to find out that this was a problem?
We went in and looked at their records. We interviewed the contracting officer. We interviewed the entity. It was clear it was a problem on many levels, and I guess I feel like I maybe missed an opportunity with the Congresswoman when she asked a question about fixing, and I refer to Mr. Jordan's answer just a minute ago. I think on all fronts we could do better to look at the capacity of these companies. In this case, it was a company of one or two people. And I've only heard, I don't know for a fact, that it was run out of someone's living room. But previously, they had never done more than $100,000 a year in business. To suggest that they had the capacity to do 50% of a $250 million contract is...
Mr. Jordan, are you familiar with the US2 situation?
I have read the Inspector General's report just in preparation for this conversation, but not in depth.
To the extent you can, then here's the question I'm hoping to get an answer to. Why were they allowed to get as far as they did? Why was a company that had never done more than a couple $100,000 worth of contract end up with such a huge chunk? What part of the process broke down to where that company could get as far along as they did?
I'm not familiar enough with this case to speculate exactly where it broke down.
Well, and I'm not pointing fingers certainly at SBA. I think that the Sierra Vista contracting folks should have asked the question themselves. But it's...
Is that not part of the standard procedure, though? I mean, isn't there a form that says, have you ever done any other government contracting? If so, how big were they?
There is past performance that a company who wants to do business with the government, it attaches to their application. I'm not familiar enough with the entire process to say that it's a part of a process or not, but it seems to me that it's a practical thing that somebody would want to ask the question or would look at the capacity of a company to say, not sure that they could do this.
I recognize you're not familiar with this exact situation, but that's got to be part of the past performance, isn't it?
Yeah, the contracting officer will make what's called a responsibility determination that this prime contractor is responsible, is capable of performing on the contract and abiding by all of the clauses. And in the 8A context, it is a business development program, so we want them to grow and that sort of thing. But so SBA will look at that and agree with them. But in this specific case, I'm not sure.
Thank you all very much. Mr. Jordan, I'm serious about those suggestions. If the SBA wants to start looking at a way to close some of those good faith, safe harbor loopholes, it's certainly something that this subcommittee would be interested in taking up in the upcoming year. So, Ms. Kendall, thank you very much. I understand you have another time commitment. Thank you all both. We'll go ahead and seat the second panel now and move through that as quickly as we can.
Thank you.
Oh, do you really? Good. Good. That might be a nice little thing for us to knock out quickly next year. You've got Thanks very much again to everybody for waiting. The second panel, I'm going to introduce Mrs. Bisegli, Jennifer Bisegli, who's the owner of Interos, a small woman-owned supply chain and logistics company. Ms. Bisegli is testifying on behalf of Women Impacting Public Policy, and Mrs. Chu is going to introduce our other witness.
Yes, I have the honor of introducing Jamie Borromeo, and she's the president of E&J Commission, a federal contracting research and strategies firm, which is based in Washington, D.C., and she's the co-founder and CEO of Generation Drive Entrepreneurs Network, which is a national nonprofit that mentors young adult startup firms. She's consulted with over a dozen Fortune 500 senior executives, CEOs, and community-based organizations on issues of economic development, public contracting, supplier diversity, and public policy, and also is a former executive director of the National Council of Asian American Business Associations. Welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Bisegli. We're going to ask you to begin. And again, 5 minutes, give or take. When you see the red light on, it means your 5 minutes is up.
Chair Mulvaney, Ranking Member Chu, my name is Jennifer Bisegli. Thank you for inviting me to testify today on behalf of Women Impacting Public Policy, or WIP, a nonpartisan organization that represents nearly 1 million women business owners with a coalition of 59 organizations that support its policy objectives. I serve as chair of the board of WIP, and I'm also president of Interos Solutions, which is a small, woman-owned company specializing in integrated logistics strategies, specifically as it relates to cybersecurity and supply chain risk management. Currently, 100% of our billable work is subcontracting in the federal government sector. Just 2 years ago, my company was growing, we had 10 employees, and we were very optimistic about our work in the government. Unfortunately, we had a development transpire with our largest prime contractor. In the span of about 2 months, they released 5 of my people, which in fact cut my business in half. We had no recourse. The company had cut off any relationship we would have had with a contracting officer or with a government program manager. The only relationship was with the prime. At that point, I couldn't point to any other violations in the subcontracting plan because those were never shared with us. In short, there was really nothing we could do about the situation and really felt pretty powerless. If there is a silver lining that I could share today, it really forced us to diversify the prime contractors and customers that we were working with, and we're actually now seeking prime contracts on our own. But it's not really a pretty solution, if you will, and it's been a pretty painful experience. The title of this hearing is Subpar Subcontracting, which encapsulates the experiences of many WIP members who do subcontracting in the federal government. Many of us are happy for the work, but frustrated when it comes to the limited rights that our small businesses have with respect to carrying out that work. The Small Business Jobs Act of 2010 contained an important provision, which WIP advocated for, a requirement that prime contractors must use those subcontractors listed in the subcontracting plans. We refer to this as if you list us, use us. We're interested in knowing whether this requirement has actually made any tangible impact within the agencies. While we're on the subject of the subcontracting plans, we wonder if prime contractors actually formally file those subcontracting plans. Does anyone in the government actually read them? And if they read them, how are they enforced at all? WIP also suggests that the Federal Government should require disclosure of the portion of the subcontracting plan as it relates to that sublisted. The Government should require the primes to share that information with the subcontractor upon award. If the subcontractors do not have access to these plans, how can we ever be sure if the prime is actually compliant? WIP does not believe the answer is to do away with filing the subcontracting plans. We think the answer is really better enforcement of those plans. Reminders are commonly used tools in calendaring software, so the solution we would think would be something just as simple, alerting the affected parties or the monitoring parties that the plan has not been filed or updated. A more fundamental problem is the confusion surrounding limitations on subcontracting contained in the Small Business Act. First, we actually learned something in preparing this testimony because we as small businesses are repeatedly told that primes are required to perform 51% of the work. Upon reviewing the law, we actually found that the actual percentage is only 50%. Let me just say that if the agencies don't understand the rules, small businesses are certainly not going to understand them or argue with that. While we definitely assume that and accept that our responsibility as Federal contractors are to read and understand we are, after all, running businesses, and the rule just doesn't really make much sense. In the case of service contracts, the prime is actually required to perform 50% of the cost of contract performance incurred for personnel with employees of the prime. As we interpret this, in order for us to be compliant with this requirement, we would actually have to know our subcontractors' personnel costs to make that calculation. No business that we know is really going to share that information, whether it be a commercial contract or a government contract. Second, this requirement basically requires a cost-based accounting system to monitor that many small businesses are not required to use, and therefore we don't use because of the cost. WIP suggests that the subcommittee take a look at amending the law to require 50% of the price of the contract, not the cost of the contract. In addition, it's our view that in case of the small business set-aside contracts, 50% should be calculated by including all of the small businesses on the contract, not just the prime. While we're on the subcontracting, the subject of subcontracting plans again, we note that there really are only two databases in which subcontracting plans are entered, FSRS and ESRS. It seems to us that the two databases are collecting much of the same information and really do not communicate with each other. This strikes us as an example of wasteful effort on the part of the government and the businesses that file the paperwork with those systems. We are unable to identify any penalties for noncompliance in either systems as well. In conclusion, subcontracting is a good way for women-owned businesses to get involved in government contracting. With the implementation of the Women-Owned Small Business Procurement Program, we expect the ability to bid on prime contracts will increase. Nevertheless, many small businesses excel in the subcontracting arena. WIP urges the subcommittee to examine and push for changes that will make more small businesses successful subcontractors. Our suggestions and observations in summary are as follows. Compliance requirements can only work if penalties are in place. WIP believes that in order to make the subcontracting rule effective, the percentage should be clarified. Is it 50% or is it 51%? In the case of small business set-aside contracts, we urge that all small businesses on the contract should be counted towards the 50% requirement. And finally, we believe a few basic changes in the electronic reporting systems could result in much better data on subcontracting plans, thereby enhancing compliance. Thank you for giving WIP the opportunity to testify on this important issue, and we welcome any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Biseglia. Again, we'll hold our questions till the end. Mrs. Borromeo, please, 5 minutes, give or take.
Chairman Mulvaney, Ranking Member Chu, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Jamie Borromeo, and I am the president of the E&J Commission, LLC, which is a contract research and strategies consulting firm for disadvantaged businesses. We are based here in Washington, D.C. In my former capacity as executive director of the National Council of Asian American Business Associations, and in my former position as intern to Congressman Mike Honda, who was the chair of the Congressional Asian Caucus at the time, I was exposed to a number of small business owners across America who had voiced their challenges within both commercial and government contracting. Entering the federal market is one of the most challenging areas to break into as a small business owner, but even more so if cultural and linguistic barriers prevent one from being able to understand the complexities of government systems. So now, after 10 years of working with communities of color, I am certain that institutional discrimination within federal contracting still exists, and this is highlighted in the lack of subcontracting opportunities for our community. Subcontracting is the first point of entry for most small businesses attempting to enter the federal market because 1, agencies like to see past performance from those seeking award, and 2, subcontracting allows for the slow growth necessary so that the small business can gain experience, capacity, and can acclimate to doing business in the federal contracting space. Discrimination within the subcontracting process is very difficult to prove, especially when those on the program level are not outwardly excluding small business from participating. What some are doing is turning a blind eye to the issues. It is in their dispassionate and apathetic approach to the matter, rather than their intentional, overtly discriminatory practices, which is the injustice in this case. Doing nothing is just as bad as causing harm, and the lack of oversight of these passive actions are what concern me the most. The first point I would like to address is the lack of compliance with the subcontracting plans administered by the contracting officers. I understand from many industry experts that there is an issue with contracting officers not properly evaluating subcontracting plans or monitoring, evaluating, and documenting contractor performance. I have worked alongside the Asian American Justice Center, a civil rights organization for Asian Americans that address these issues through their contractor empowerment program, currently led by Ms. Jeanette Lee. We have partnered to identify some of these challenges and have collected testimonials from small business contractors. Some are hesitant to provide testimonial because they are afraid of being blackballed or not maintaining good rapport with an agency they still would like to receive work from. However, some brave contractors have emerged from the pack to describe their unjust experiences. In our findings, we discovered fraudulent practices that create barriers to contracting opportunities for Asian Americans, women, and other minorities, as outlined by Ms. Jeanette Lee in this statement, where she describes bait and switch. And I quote, "Because there is no enforcement, prime contractors often team up with minority contractors in order to win a bid, but then drop them from the contract once they receive the award. I've heard this from several Asian American contractors that this is a prevalent and pervasive occurrence." These, among many others, are testimonials from contractors that are still looking for an entity to hold primes accountable for what was promised to these small businesses. Another issue I would like to point out is that most contracts that are moved from large defense contractors to small businesses to reach set-aside goals are still controlled and dictated by the large contractor in the end, in regards to who needs to be hired, what salaries they will be paid, and what benefits they will receive. The way that this occurs is large contractors keep a list of disadvantaged business enterprises that are willing to do just about anything for a contract. It is common practice for a large contractor to work with an agency to move some of their contracts, which have recently been designated for set-aside programs, to large contractors' preferred vendors. These vendors will then continue to employ virtually all the same employees that the large contractor employed with identical compensation packages. Therefore, in essence, these employees are still working for the large defense contractors who maintain the specifics of their employment throughout the process. When the small business protests, they seem to find that their current and/or future contracts disappear from the federal agency, if not the federal space as a whole. Because the small business owner is hungry for work, they feel lucky to be in the game. Money for morals is what is up for trade here, and until there are more small business opportunities and legitimate ones, it's all one closed network that is circulating contracts and dollars among their own without informing or much less encouraging competition. Lastly, a major issue I would like to present for the record is the lack of market research conducted to find qualified small businesses. With Silicon Valley as my former home, I witnessed some of the most creative, talented, and capable small businesses in the country produce and engineer products and services that are currently provided by large contractors. The boutique-sized company has just as many robust capabilities to do the work. However, because adequate market research is not conducted, government agencies are not utilizing their services. Making the connection with these companies takes additional work, but as one large defense contractor admitted to me, I quote, "We don't have time to look through databases. If we find an opportunity, we're going to our existing contacts." The challenge for subcontracting then becomes who you know, and whom you know is not necessarily determined by your skill, capability, or work ethic. My recommendations to the subcommittee is twofold. Number one, we must ensure that contracting officers and technical representatives are complying with rules and systems in place to ensure prime contractors are performing well on existing contracts and subcontracting the proper amount to small business. This can be done by requiring past performance reports are executed by the COTAR team. The contractor should perform monthly performance reports and check-ins with the contractors. I interviewed one former contracting officer who said that if the agencies and agency heads made it a priority in the contracting office, surely the contracting officer would as well. It takes leadership to enforce these, and agencies are predominantly focused on prime contracts, but now we need concerted efforts to focus subcontracting efforts. Number two, diligent and proper market research performed by program offices is necessary. I have met a number of small business representatives, but access to the program office is nearly impossible unless you have an existing relationship. And existing relationships are usually formed through large federal primes that allow the small business into their network. Program office and technical reps should be required to do just as many meet and greets as the small business offices are. Taking a meeting with a new small business is declined for fear of protest on bids. Those are the excuses I've heard from the program offices, but it should be a requirement to know the leadership behind who is providing the goods and services for the federal government, which is paid for by the American taxpayer. It is our right to meet with those making the executive decision on who is winning these contracts and monitoring subcontracting plans. Leadership of agencies should also encourage the program office to network with the small business program office within the agency so they build good rapport amongst each other. I have additional comments I would like inserted in the congressional record that were not stated in this verbal testimony. So in the interest of time, I would like to thank the subcommittee for inviting me to this hearing, and I'd be happy to hear any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Borromeo. And rest assured, your additional comments will be made part of the record. Before I turn it over to Ms. Chu, I want to thank you, ladies, for coming in. I was making comments to staff as you were speaking along two lines. Number one, that many of the recommendations that you've simply made, just now made in your presentations, staff has made to this committee as well. And we will be pursuing many of those in the upcoming months. Secondly, and I know Mrs. Chu would back me up on this, I would like in the future to make sure, do every effort that we can to have the real people testify before the agency people do. I'd like to hear from the business owners, from the business operators before I hear from the agency, so that, because you've raised several questions here today that I'd love to have Mr. Jordan and, I can't remember the other one's name, Ms. Kendall back again. So next time we'll try and get the real world testimony on the record before we let the agency folks go. It would be a great opportunity for you to ask questions through us of the folks who are actually in a position to help you right away. So with that, I'll turn over to Ms. Chu for her questions.
Well, Ms. Bisegli, you had several suggestions for improvements on the subcontracting process, and one area had to do with how the costs are calculated. You have to, the small business prime contractor has to perform a percentage of work based on the cost of the contract, but in so many cases, the small businesses don't have the resources to calculate their own costs, let alone a subcontractor's costs. So, do the requirements as written make it difficult for small businesses to calculate the work that they must perform, and which ways could it be made simpler and easier for small businesses to understand?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think the difference that we're sharing is that all businesses should understand their cost. The challenge is that most businesses are not going to share their true costs with other businesses. So our suggestion is that the percentage of work is based on the overall price. So if I am working with a prime, I can give them my rolled up price that it will take me to do that work versus my costs, which in effect is profit minus what it actually cost me to do. And that's where the rub is. Mm-hmm. So the suggestion is to look at just the grand total of what it's going to, my price to that prime, versus asking for any breakdown of costs. So that would be the difference, is to look at the grand total of price on the contract.
Mm-hmm. Very good suggestion. Ms. Borromeo, in your testimony, you talked about how some Asian Pacific American businesses are afraid to speak up about the discrimination and challenges they face as small business contractors and subcontractors. Do you have an example of these testimonies that we can insert into the record?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I would like to have unanimous consent that this example be inserted into the record.
Accepted without objection.
Okay. Thank you. What systems need to be in place to make businesses comfortable with bringing up some of these problems to light?
I think realistically, small business owners probably won't just come out and say that they're going through this. Like I said in my testimonial, they want to keep the current work they have or the relationships that they have with the agencies or the prime contractor. But if SBA or another entity within the federal government is actually they actually have some measurements or oversight reports that are happening more frequently, I think that might be a way, instead of the small business owner having to come out. They're already the little guy in this, and if you're trying to take down Goliath, some of these large prime contractors that are making multi-billion dollars off of federal government contracts, it's very difficult to come out with an honest testimony about what's happening to them. So I think that it's going to be the responsibility of either SBA or whatever entity you see fit for this to really hold them accountable with more reporting and just taking notes on where they are in their performance. When I interviewed the former contracting officer, he said he didn't feel like the agency was enforcing it. And I said, well, do you have too much on your plate? Or do you have too much work that wouldn't allow you to do these reports? He said, no, if they made it a priority, we could absolutely do it. So I know that from a testimonial from an actual contracting officer that it can be done. It's just you don't ever see these people, and there's not really any accountability on the agency level. A lot of the time they're going to OSDBU or the small business reps for these answers when they should be going directly to the contracting officers.
What should SBA, MBDA, and other agencies tasked with improving access to these contracts do to make sure that more Asian Pacific American businesses and other minority businesses and women-owned businesses secure contracts?
What should they?
What should the SBA and MBDA and other agencies?
Well, the subcontracting plans are already required for them to submit, and so it's about follow through and making sure that they actually stick to the subcontracting plan that was submitted. So, like I said, they're not doing the reviews thoroughly. So I think that Mr. Jordan had expressed that they meet with them annually. But, meeting annually doesn't mean that they're actually performing the work well or even subcontracting fairly. And so I think there has to be more frequent reviews and penalties incurred if they're not meeting the goals of their subcontracting plans.
Very good. I would like to ask about how the subcontracting plans are being carried out by, say, for instance, the commercial market representatives, which are supposed to be counseling the large prime contractors on their responsibilities. So either of you, I'd like to ask in your opinion, are the commercial market representatives doing their job on this front and aiding small businesses in marketing themselves to the large businesses?
I can go ahead and answer. I've been to a number of trade shows, networking events that SBA hosts, and I've never met a CMR before. Even when someone had asked me about the CMRs and SBA before, I said, what is a CMR? So I think that they're not relevant in the contracting process. And unless people like myself who are constantly meeting with, contracting or attempting to meet contracting officers don't even know about CMRs, I think it's more of an awareness campaign maybe SBA needs to do to make sure that these CMRs are visible and relevant to the contracting process.
I absolutely agree with that.
Have you ever met one?
No. Not during my business, from an Antero's perspective, no.
That's pretty shocking. So, then let me ask about this. The large prime contractors must submit subcontracting plans for review, and if the contracting officer finds that plans are inadequate, he or she can decide not to award the contract. In your experience, how often does that happen?
In the example of talking to the contracting officer again, he said that he's had colleagues that want to terminate contracts after a prime has been performing for a year, saying they're just not, doing what they said they were going to do. And he asked a colleague, why, what are your grounds for terminating him? You haven't been taking notes on or reporting anything that they've been doing. And he said, well, it's not a requirement, so I'm not going to do it. So it's a lack of oversight. You can't just terminate a contract without grounds. And so if they're not required to enter the data or report on how a contractor is performing, then it's just not going to happen. It's an enforcement issue from the agency level. And my experience working with the agency reps is OSDBU, a lot of the time the OSDBU reps are doing a fantastic job. They just don't have any power within the agency to really affect any change. And that's where the barrier is. I only meet with OSDBU reps. When I ask for a COTAR, when I ask for a technical rep or a contracting officer, they refuse to meet with me until the solicitation is out on the street. And it's like, well, I can't, if I can't understand what the requirements are before it's out on FedBizOps, how are we supposed to prepare for the bid? And so it's an unfair advantage to federal contractors who are experienced in this space because they already know the requirements. They already have the in with the agency. They already know the COTAR. And so it doesn't allow for new vendors to enter the marketplace.
And I think I would absolutely agree. And I think again, from an Antero standpoint, it's twofold. And as she mentioned, the first part is the compliance. Are they actually being filed? Is anyone actually looking at them? And is there any penalty for not being compliant? To the question, or one piece of the question that you asked, though, I think from a subcontractor standpoint, and what I shared earlier in my testimony is that those subcontracting plans are never shared with us. So there's a total lack of transparency. So when you ask if they're filed or if they're enforced, I don't have an idea. And again, when you have larger contracts that go on for 5 to 10 years, as Mr. Jordan mentioned, there's an ebb and a flow to how the subcontracting plans are implemented because it's over the lifetime of the contract. So in that, if there's a lack of transparency from the bottom up and there's a lack of compliance from the top down, there's a little bit of a who knows going on out there.
I'd also like to ask about the contractors who over-report their subcontracting achievements. In 2010, it was reported that small businesses received over 34% of subcontracting dollars, yet there have been cases that found that prime contractors were over-reporting their small business subcontracting. Either of you, in your estimation, what percentage of subcontracting dollars is actually going to small businesses?
And I'll defer. I don't know if you have a shake on that. Again, I defer to the fact that we have never been in the situation to have the transparency, even on the contracts we're on, to have an answer for you. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a lot of the small businesses that I represent, they're not even given the opportunity, so I can't even answer that question. Right. They're not given the opportunity to even compete. So it's a question of, can I even just compete on this so that I can answer that question? I mean, that's a big issue. It's
a competition, but it's also, to your point, when the filing occurs and the percentages are reported, we have no visibility to that. We don't have any visibility to how the overall subcontracting plan was executed, much less our actual role on it. So if at the time of the contract award, if the prime says we're going to subcontract 10% of the award to Anteros, we're never told that, and it's never measured at the end because we are not actually, except for the public information that you can actually pay for in FOIA, that you can see how large the contract was, you don't know where that 10% falls at any point in time. So it's a very difficult answer to provide to you at this stage.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. And you, I think we shared a little bit of surprise at the fact that nobody had ever seen a commercial market representative. Staff informs me there are 35 or 36 of them nationwide, many of them part-time, overseeing $200 billion worth of contracts. So not a surprise that you haven't seen them yet. Ms. Borromeo, let me press you on one issue because I did read the submission from the Asian American Justice Center, and I'm more than willing to consider that the possibility for discrimination exists. I used to work with large contractors building roads and bridges and so forth, and you certainly did not see a lot of women-owned businesses out on those jobs. So again, I'm willing to entertain the possibility that the potential exists, but are you saying that you're seeing evidence of discrimination based upon the fact that groups are a particular race or creed or gender, or is it because do you believe you're being discriminated against based upon the size of your company?
I think it's both. I think small businesses in general, based on size, all experience this, but I think it becomes even more complex when You have cultural or linguistic barriers that don't allow for you to communicate your point as well as maybe other vendors would. So I think small businesses as a whole are not being treated very fairly in this space. But when you add, like I said, the cultural and linguistic aspects to it, it becomes very difficult. And if you also don't understand how government works, they would be they'd be afraid to talk to you right now, thinking that you're gonna hand them over to the police.
Don't feel bad. Yeah. One of the traditional ways we try and deal with that is by trying to make the process as neutral as possible. Having been through the subcontracting process, do you see places where we can change the process in order to remove the potential for discrimination based upon race or gender?
I think employing more folks in the federal government that would understand the cultural nuances of some of these folks. I think that if you have people that understand, how a person grows up or how they communicate, it's increasing the diversity within the space, hiring more women, hiring more minorities to represent in the contracting space would make it much easier.
Let me go through a sort of a real world scenario. Let's say I'm a prime contractor and I've got a Department of Defense subcontract and I'm looking to subcontract some of it out. I may post it on various websites and so forth. I don't understand the exact logistics of that. But at some point, I'm going to receive a bunch of inquiries, either in paper or over email or so forth. Is there some part of that process that says, oh, wait a second, it allows me to say that's a woman-owned business, that's an Asian-owned business? Is there something that's broken in that system?
I believe that they're not collecting data at this point regarding who's a minority or who's a woman. So that's one issue. The second issue is they're not posting these things. So you don't even know that a subcontracting opportunity exists except within your own little network. And it's when the prime contractors let you in. You have to hobnob in the same circles with them. And it can cost a whole lot of money to go and network with them. And you just have to have the connections. And if you're not familiar with a culture or with a language or things like that, or you're not comfortable interacting with another gender, then it might be very difficult to make that.
If we had more time today with Mr. Jordan, we would have pressed him on some of the shortcomings that we've perceived in the SBA regarding the postings and the making information available. Ms. Besegley, you looked like you had some input on that process as to where it might be improved.
I actually, just from a support standpoint, one of the pieces from a governmental perspective to support what Jamie just shared is the passage of the Women's Set-Aside program. So the government's admitting that there's gender bias within government procurement. So I just wanted to bring that up as a resounding support point to her case.
And again, I'm willing to admit it. I'm trying to fix it through the process. Again, if you gave me a document, if you made an application for a subcontract on my prime, and the name of your business was ABC Subcontracting, it's unlikely that I would ever know that you were a woman-owned business, is my point. So, again, I'm willing to admit that the potential is there. I'm just trying to figure out at what point in the process you let people know you're a woman-owned business so that you can be discriminated against.
Well, maybe when they're looking for these subcontractors, they could ask if they qualify for any of these set-aside programs or if, they're a DBE. So, number one, let's post it on Subnet. I went on Subnet and I actually talked to Joe Jordan's office about it. And I said, you guys only have a couple hundred subcontracts posted on this. I said, is there a more robust database that I can go to for this? Oh, everything's posted on FedBizOps. It's not posted there. And I talked to a prime contractor, a large defense contractor, who told me that they're not required by the federal government to do that. So, and they just don't like your system, so they're not going to do it. They have their own system of identifying qualified contractors.
And I think that's, if I may, back to the compliance issue. Many of the large primes do follow similar compliance to the socioeconomic standards that are out there. So they go for a certain percentage of 8As, a certain percentage of women-owned businesses. So they're out there, and very frequently, directly to your question, when we receive an RFP from one of those large primes, there's a checkbox that says which of these socioeconomic standards or set-asides do you file under. So you check women-owned, you check small business, what have you. So right up front, very often, you announce where you fit. I think it goes back to compliance, though, if I may, in that there's no teeth that says that we need to actually implement the diversity that we're asking for. So we're starting to ask the questions and the information is being shared, but there's no compliance that says that we actually adhere to those levels.
And it strikes me, I know I asked the question, but it struck me as you were giving your answer that there's a catch-22 here, which is there is a requirement that's a target. I think I can't remember if it's 3% or 5% for women-owned business, certain for service-disabled veterans, and so forth. And in order to meet the requirement, you're required to disclose that you would fall into those categories. So again, you're in a catch-22. If you want this completely blind test that would not allow discrimination, you wouldn't be able to satisfy the requirements of the requirements that we've set. Interesting issue. Ms. Bisegli, very briefly to you. You talked a bit about the transparency and about the small business plan not being shared with you. I'm sympathetic to that, but I've also been a subcontractor. I've been a contractor. It'd be rare that I would share information about my contract with my owner with my sub. Not typically something that I would do. What would you be most interested in seeing in that if you had your will?
If I had my will, I'd be most interested in seeing the part of the response that affected me. So how were they measuring the success of my relationship with the prime? And you're right. Even as a potential prime contractor, there may be subcontractors that we share information with and some that we don't.
Right.
I mean, again, from a small business to a small business, there's a bit more the relationship's a little bit different than a very, very large business. So I can absolutely accept that. But I think understanding, if the prime contractor is going to be held to a level of compliance based on how they're dealing with me, it'd be nice to have a voice in that fight.
Agreed. Go back to the specifics of the contract that y'all dealt with. Did they breach the contract with you? I mean, and the reason I ask, and it's completely off topic perhaps for why we're here today, is we've had some insourcing hearings this year, and we've heard testimony about folks getting kicked off of contracts, and one of the questions I always ask is, did they breach the contract? Did the contract terminate? What were the grounds under which they were allowed to displace 5 of your folks?
I don't know. What I was told is that the folks, all 5 of them, were not working out, and they were instantly replaced with 5 of the prime's people. So again, from our standpoint, it would have been nice to know what was reported to anybody managing the subcontracting plan. One, from just the referenceability from my own company. From the contracting, the people, all 5 of those people had worked on previous contracts for me with never a problem, so it was a surprise. And the larger surprise, back to our wish and our desire to understand the compliance with the subcontracting plan, is that it was swift. It was, your people are gone in less than 5 days. So it wasn't, this isn't working out, we need to change it. It was just very quick, and they replaced with their own people. So it was all Department of Defense work. My guess is that it was a budgetary situation, but we don't know, which again is why we're asking for the transparency and the understanding of the compliance of the subcontracting plan.
All right. Thank you for that. And because again, it strikes me that you have a contract, and I could never just break my subcontract with my subcontractors unless the contract allowed me to do so. My last line of question relates to the experience you had in transitioning from a sub to a prime. How did you find it generally? Was your experience as a sub helpful to you when you tried to do it? And are there things you learned as a sub that have made you a better prime contractor, dealing with your own subs?
Right. So the only 2 prime contracts we have right now are very large IDIQs, and we've not gotten billable work. They're relatively new for us. And right now we have 3 proposals to be prime contractors. So we have not been awarded as a prime yet. As far as the process, the one thing I will share with you is, and I'll tell you, one of the bids that we have in right now is with a very, very large contractor as a sub to us. And the other 2 are with mid-tier or smaller businesses just because of the work. And the one thing that's actually I've been educated on is a lot of what I shared here in the testimony. It was very easy for me to be here today because we have a very different relationship with our subs on these bids, as well as the ones that are on with the IDIQs, than we have had with our primes in the past. And part of it is the transparency and the working relationship that we're trying to foster. So it's kind of like, be the change that you want to see. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing that we've learned. So we're already implementing a lot of that transparency with our subcontractors, and hope and look to continue that once we get awarded the work.
The past performance report, did you find it to be a fair process? Did you find it to be helpful to you? Did you find it to be a hindrance?
As far as filing our price performance?
Right.
I think it's just, we're fortunate. We've been in business for 6 years, and I've been in the same industry for over 20. So from a past performance standpoint, we're very, very fortunate in the fact that we can definitely stand on our own laurels. So it's a lot of paperwork, but I think it's fair in the fact that it's pretty, again, to Jamie's point, it's pretty blind as far as that's concerned. It's a standard template. You fill it out, you put your point of contact so that they can check everything, and for us it's been fine.
Would you have been able to go straight to prime contract, or would you have to have gone through the sub programs in order to qualify?
It depends on the contract. Some of them need specific relevant past performance. Again, because the way that I'm building my company, all of my people have at least 10 to 15 years experience in this industry, so I'm a little bit of an anomaly in that standpoint. I think that the benefit of coming in as a subcontractor is that I had the ability to learn a lot of what it takes to be a federal government contractor on somebody else's time, if you will. And we've been able to foster some of the relationships that are going to make us much more successful going forward.
Have either of you ladies participated, or know anybody has participated in the mentor programs?
I was actually just going to say that. One of my clients has been with the DHS Mentor Protege program for a year, and there's no extra merit in being part of that program.
Yeah, we've actually done Department of Defense and DHS, and I would absolutely agree. I think
they're there for show.
Well, I think that what I've seen, and I actually attended the Mentor Protege conference, and I think that what I saw was that, and this again, this all is in Teros, I think that the programs largely came out of being product companies. So if I wanted to sell product to the government, and so the Raytheons and the Boeings and those sort of company have very, very successful programs. We're services, and I think it's a little bit more difficult. And a clear example is that our mentor in the Department of Defense program, we thought it would work because they understood what we do for a living, yet then within their own company, there was a stress factor of why should we bring in a sub because that takes work away from us. And we're not an IT company, we're a supply chain company. So if you can only imagine with as many IT contractors you have in this area, that issue is all over the place. So I think that what I've heard from peers that have been part of the program, if you're with one of the larger that started as a product and move over to services, that they have seen a lot of success. But if just services to services, it's a little bit tougher to implement.
Ladies, thank you very much. I appreciate the testimonies. It's fascinating stuff. We could do it all day, but everybody's been here 3 hours, and I do apologize again for the long hearing. This committee will work to expand opportunities for small business and compete for federal contracts, both as prime and subcontractors. We'll keep in mind that there's a lot of room for improvement. Thank you specifically for your suggested improvements. Those will not go unheard of or unresponded to. Ms. Borromeo, thank you for this. This will be included in the record. And I think this really does help me and the ranking member try and get a feel for where we want to take this subcommittee, especially next year. So with that, I'll ask unanimous consent that we have 5 days to revise and extend our remarks or to ask questions of the witnesses. Again, witnesses, thank you very much. Thank you all for sticking around for 3 hours. Ms. Chu, it's always a pleasure. And with that, we will adjourn for the day.
Thank you.